In 2015, a mother in South Carolina let her 9-year-old walk alone to a nearby park, about half a mile from their house. A stranger called the police. Child Protective Services was notified. The family went through an investigation. The following year, a mother in Maryland let her 10-year-old and 6-year-old walk together to a local park, roughly a mile from home. Same outcome. Investigation, notification, the implicit message from the state. Your judgment as a parent is insufficient. Children outside alone are children in danger. These weren't cases of neglect. These were ordinary acts of childhood independence, the kind that, for most of human history, would have been unremarkable, even expected. The kind that happened in most American neighborhoods as recently as the 1980s, without incident and without legal consequence. In Japan, those same children would have been doing something considered not just acceptable, but developmentally necessary. Across Tokyo, Osaka, Kyoto, Nagoya, cities of millions of people, dense by any global standard, with all the complexity and unpredictability of major urban environments. Children in their first year of primary school walk to school without adult accompaniment. Not occasionally, not as an exception for particularly capable children. Routinely in groups called toban organized by the school, with older children taking responsibility for younger ones. Wearing their small backpacks and yellow safety hats, navigating streets and crosswalks and train station exits on their own. First graders, 6 years old. The Western response to this, when people encounter it for the first time, tends to range from admiration to disbelief to something approaching horror. The risks seem obvious, and to anyone raised in the current Western culture of childhood protection, they seem enormous. Traffic, strangers, getting lost, the thousand things that could go wrong in the space between the front door and the school. But here's the question that reframes the whole picture. Not whether Japanese streets are safer than American ones. They are, though not dramatically enough to explain the cultural difference. But what happens to the children who walk that distance every morning? Because the research on that question is one of the clearest and most consistent bodies of evidence in developmental psychology, and what it says runs directly counter to the protective instinct. The framework for understanding this comes primarily from the work of researchers studying what has been called risky play and childhood independence. The word risky is a technical term here, not a judgment. It refers to activities that involve genuine uncertainty, genuine consequence, and genuine challenge. The child might fall. The child might get lost. The child might fail. These are not bugs in the activity. In the developmental research, they are the features. Ellen Sandberg at the University of Illinois has produced some of the most comprehensive longitudinal data on the developmental effects of childhood independence. Her research, following children over multiple participating years, found that children who regularly navigated their environments independently, walking routes, exploring neighborhoods, being responsible for getting themselves from one place to another, showed higher scores on executive function, better emotional regulation, stronger self-efficacy, and lower rates of anxiety as adolescents compared to children whose movement was more consistently supervised and managed. Each of those outcomes deserves a closer look because they are not trivial and they don't go away when you become an adult. Executive function is the cluster of cognitive abilities that governs planning, decision-making, working memory, and the capacity to override impulse in favor of a longer-term goal. It is among the strongest predictors of academic achievement, professional success, financial stability, and physical health across a lifespan. It is also primarily developed, not genetically endowed, but developed through experiences that require the child to manage complexity without an adult managing it for them. A child walking to school alone is making decisions continuously. Which route to take today? How to handle the intersection where the signal is confusing? What to do when a friend wants to stop and they're already running late? How to respond when an older child from a different toban group says something unpleasant? These are not life or death decisions, but they are real ones, with real consequences, managed entirely by the child. The prefrontal cortex, which is the brain hardware of executive function, develops in direct proportion to the complexity and authenticity of the decisions it is asked to make. A child who is driven to school every morning, whose route is managed by an adult, whose decisions are made for them at every junction, is a child whose prefrontal cortex is not receiving this input. Not damaged, just not trained. the way a muscle that's never exercised is not damaged, just undeveloped. Self-efficacy is a specific psychological construct defined by Albert Bandura, one of the most cited researchers in the history of psychology. It is not confidence in the general sense, not the feeling of being a good person or being liked. It is the specific belief that your own actions can affect outcomes, that what you do has consequences, that you are, in some meaningful sense, capable of navigating the world. Self-efficacy is not built by being told you can do things. It is built by doing them. Specifically, by doing things that are hard enough to be uncertain, succeeding or managing the failure, and experiencing the direct causal connection between your effort and the outcome. A child who walks a mile to school every morning, manages the route, handles what comes up, and arrives, that child has done something. Not something dramatic, but something real, repeated, and consequence-linked. And across weeks and months and years of this, the neural representation of "I can handle things" becomes increasingly robust. The child knows they can handle things not because someone told them so, but because they have evidence. This is the developmental mechanism that Japanese culture has intuitively built into every school morning for over a century, not because of any theory, because the culture's orientation toward children has always included the assumption that challenge, given appropriately and gradually, produces capability, not injury. There's a Japanese phrase that's useful here, kodomo no jidai. It means the age of children, the period of childhood that is understood as having its own developmental imperatives, its own appropriate freedoms, its own texture of experience. In Japanese thinking, this period is not primarily a period to be protected from the world. It is a period in which children should be actively engaging with the world within progressively expanding parameters under the general supervision of the community rather than the constant supervision of individual parents. The toban system, the group of children walking together, led by the older and steadied by the younger, is an expression of this. It distributes the responsibility for facing across the children themselves, and in doing so, it teaches them something that no adult supervision can, that they are responsible for each other. The older child in the group, who makes sure the younger ones cross safely, is not being burdened. They are being given something that developmental psychology identifies as among the most powerful of all developmental experiences: genuine responsibility for others. The sociologist Suzanne Gaskins, who has studied children's work and responsibility across cultures, describes this as the apprenticeship model of childhood. In cultures where children are integrated into genuine community responsibility early, not performing tasks for adults, but taking on tasks the community actually needs done, children develop social competence, emotional regulation, and a sense of social belonging at rates that supervised, protected children reliably do not. The Japanese elementary school child carrying their younger neighbor to school on their first day is not being asked to do adult work. They're being given an experience that their brain, at that age, is perfectly designed to learn from. The anxiety piece is, in some ways, the most immediately relevant for contemporary Western parents, because anxiety disorders in children and adolescents have been increasing significantly and consistently for several decades in the United States, the UK, and across most of the developed Western world. The mechanisms are multiple and complex, and no single factor explains the trend. But one factor that researchers in multiple disciplines have converged on is the relationship between decreasing childhood independence and increasing childhood anxiety. Jonathan Hutt and Greg Lukianoff, in their analysis of adolescent mental health trends, identify the reduction of unsupervised outdoor play and independent childhood movement as a significant contributor to rising anxiety rates. Their argument is physiological as much as psychological. Children who are not exposed to manageable challenge, uncertainty, and consequence in childhood do not develop the regulatory systems that allow them to process challenge, uncertainty, and consequence in adolescence and adulthood. The nervous system learns to tolerate uncertainty by being exposed to it in conditions where the consequences are real but survivable. A child who has never managed a route alone, never made a decision that mattered, never experienced the gap between wanting help and having to figure it out. That child's processing the anxiety management requires. When the challenges of adolescence arrive, the toolbox is lighter than it should be. Japanese children at 6, 7, 8, walking their routes, managing their mornings, taking care of each other in the toban, are building exactly this toolbox. Not consciously, not as a program, as the ordinary consequence of a culture that gives children the world in appropriately sized pieces and trusts them to handle it. This is not an argument for sending a 6-year-old alone into an unsafe situation. The nuance matters. The Japanese system works in part because of the structural safety it builds in. The toban groups, the community awareness, the culturally universal participation that means every child is seeing this and every adult in the neighborhood knows it. Transplanting the practice without the structural context requires adaptation, but the principle is available to every parent regardless of context. The principle is this: every time you make a decision for your child that they are capable of making for themselves, you take a small brick out of the house they are trying to build. Every time you step back and let them navigate something real, a social difficulty, an unfamiliar route, a problem with no adult solution on offer, you let them add one. The house gets built either way. The question is, who builds it? Japanese parents have always known who should be doing the building. The research has now explained why they were right.